It is just before dawn, the 1st of May, 1982, and 8 miles above Port Stanley, the air temperature outside the aircraft is close to -50. Below, the runway is empty, dark, unremarkable, a strip of asphalt on a wind-scoured island that most of the men flying toward it could not have found on a map 3 months earlier. Inside the cockpit, a 5-man crew is running final checks on a bomber that was designed, from the rivets up, to do exactly one thing: fly toward the Soviet Union and never come back. Tonight it is carrying 21 conventional bombs, no nuclear payload at all, and it has just completed the longest bombing mission in the history of aerial warfare to get here. Here is the part that doesn't add up. This aircraft, an Avro Vulcan, was days away from being scrapped. Its air-to-air refueling equipment had been stripped out years earlier because the RAF never expected to need it again. The charts its navigator needed for the South Atlantic didn't exist in RAF stores because no one had planned to fight a war there. And the target itself, a single runway roughly 8,000 miles from home, could, by most accounts, have been cratered by a fraction of the aircraft, fuel, and risk that Britain was about to spend on it. So why send a Cold War doomsday bomber on a mission that needed 11 other aircraft just to keep it in the air, to drop bombs that even the planners weren't sure would land where they were supposed to? This is not really a story about one runway in the South Atlantic. It's a story about what a country does when the tool it built for the apocalypse is the only tool it has left, and what happens when you try to make it do something it was never designed for. To understand why this raid happened at all, you have to go back to what the Vulcan actually was. It entered service in the mid-1950s as one of Britain's 3 V-bombers, built to deliver a nuclear strike against the Soviet Union in the opening hours of a war that, by design, nobody was supposed to win. It was a strategic weapon, not a tactical one, built for one kind of mission, flown by crews trained for one kind of target. By 1982, that role had effectively ended. Britain's nuclear deterrent had shifted to submarines carrying Polaris missiles, and the Vulcan force was being wound down, its aircraft heading for scrapyards and museums one squadron at a time. Then, on the 2nd of April 1982, Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, a British territory in the South Atlantic that most people in London had to look up. Britain assembled a naval task force to retake the islands, but the task force had a problem the politicians back home didn't fully grasp yet. The islands sat roughly 8,000 miles from Britain, and Argentina's air force could fly to them from bases on the mainland in under an hour. If Argentina extended its own runway at Stanley, the island's only real airstrip, it could operate fast jets from Falklands soil itself, putting combat aircraft within minutes of the British fleet instead of an hour away. Denying them that runway wasn't a nice-to-have. It was close to the whole ballgame. The trouble was reach. Britain had no aircraft carrier with the punch to guarantee a runway-killing strike, and its nearest usable airbase, on Ascension Island, was still roughly 4,000 miles from Stanley, a distance that, at the time, no bomber in the world had any business trying to fly, drop bombs, and return from in a single sortie. Hold that number. It matters more than it sounds like it should. So the RAF looked at what it had sitting in hangars, mid-retirement, and the answer was the Vulcan, a bomber whose entire design philosophy was fly high, fly far, drop something enormous, get out. The problem was that far for a Vulcan meant a few thousand miles with in-flight refueling, not 8,000. And the refueling probes that would have let it take on fuel mid-air had, for many of the remaining aircraft, been removed years before as an economy measure because nobody expected to need them again. Ground crews spent weeks, in some cases scavenging parts from Vulcans already earmarked for scrapping, refitting probes, restoring wiring, and stripping out systems tied to the aircraft's old nuclear role that had no business on a conventional bombing run. Navigators, meanwhile, discovered that the RAF's map stores held almost nothing useful for the South Atlantic. By some accounts, charts had to be sourced from commercial suppliers and even borrowed from other services because the region had simply never been a Vulcan flight plan before. And because the Vulcan's onboard navigation system would drift over a flight of that length, crews trained to fall back on old-fashioned astronavigation, a sextant, the stars, and basic trigonometry as a check against the machine. A Cold War bomber, finding its way to war with an instrument older than the aircraft itself. Here's the part that matters even more than the aircraft. Getting one Vulcan to Stanley and back required a small air force of Victor tankers flying in relay, each one refueling the next, because at that range, even the tankers needed topping up before they could top up the bomber. The plan cascaded backward from the target. For the bomber to reach Stanley with bombs and enough fuel to get home, it needed one final top-up close to the islands. The tanker that gave it that fuel needed its own top-up further back. And so on, tanker refueling tanker, all the way to Ascension. By the time the full chain was drawn out, getting a single bomber to a single runway needed roughly a dozen aircraft in the air at once, most of whose only job was to make sure someone else had enough fuel to keep going. On the night of the 30th of April 1982, two Vulcans took off from Ascension within minutes of each other. One primary aircraft, one spare, in case anything failed on the primary before the mission point of no return. Almost immediately, something did. The primary aircraft, XM598, developed a fault in a cockpit window seal that made it impossible to pressurize the cabin properly. Its crew, led by Flight Lieutenant Martin Withers, transferred to the reserve aircraft, XM607, while still over open ocean, a mid-flight swap of command that had to happen calmly, in the dark, with a war on the other end of the flight plan. Then came a second problem, and it was close to fatal for the whole mission. During one of the refueling contacts, a hose connection failed in turbulent air, and Withers's Vulcan came away from the tanker short of the fuel it needed. For a stretch of the flight, the maths simply didn't work. There wasn't enough fuel in the plan to reach Stanley, drop the bombs, and make it back to Ascension. Withers and his crew had to decide, in real time, whether to press on toward the target or abort a mission that had already burned through most of a night and most of a squadron's spare Vulcans just to get this far. They pressed on, trusting a revised refueling plan pieced together over the radio to close the gap on the way home. Hold on to that gamble. It's the reason this raid so nearly never happened, and almost nobody watching the news coverage the next day knew it. Just before dawn, XM607 climbed from its low-level approach to bombing altitude and ran in over Stanley. The crew released a stick of 21 1,000-pound bombs, not aimed to fall in a tight cluster on the runway, but laid out in a long diagonal line across it. That angle wasn't an accident, and it wasn't imprecision. Given the navigation drift possible after that many hours in the air, the crew couldn't guarantee where along the runway's length their aim point would actually fall. So instead of betting everything on pinpoint accuracy, they laid their bombs across the runway at a slant, maximizing the odds that at least one would land where it needed to. It was a bet on probability over precision. One bomb, by most accounts the closest to the runway's midpoint, struck home and tore a crater through the surface. Before we get into what that single crater actually changed, and it changed more than you'd expect from one hole in the ground, if you're finding this useful, it helps a great deal to subscribe, since these deep dive breakdowns take a fair amount of digging to put together properly. Here's the number worth sitting with. Black Buck 1, as the mission was codenamed, covered something in the region of 8,000 nautical miles there and back, in a single sortie lasting close to 16 hours, refueled in the air more than a dozen times. At the moment it happened, it was the longest range bombing raid ever flown, a record that would stand for years afterward. A bomber built to end a war that never came was instead pressed into the longest single combat flight in the history of military aviation, to deliver bombs against a runway that, on paper, a much smaller and closer strike package might have hit just as easily if Britain had possessed one. And the effect of that one crater went beyond the hole itself. Argentina had been weighing whether to base fast jets, Mirage or Skyhawk-type aircraft, directly on the islands, which would have put them minutes rather than an hour from the British fleet. The Stanley Runway was already on the short side for that kind of aircraft fully loaded. Black Buck 1's crater and the raids that followed it made the calculation worse. Argentine commanders never did commit their fast jets to Falklands soil. Whether that decision came primarily from the runway damage, from the risk of further raids, or from factors that had nothing to do with the Vulcans at all, is something historians still argue about. But the psychological weight of Britain can reach us here landed on Buenos Aires, regardless of exactly how much concrete was cratered. For more incredible true stories from World War II, carefully researched and brought to life, subscribe to the channel and never miss a new documentary. Now, the misconception. Popular retellings of this raid often leave you with the impression that the Vulcans knocked the runway out of action for the rest of the war. They didn't. Argentine engineers had the crater patched, by most accounts, within a day or two, and transport aircraft continued using Stanley's runway on and off throughout the conflict to resupply the garrison. Black Buck 1 did not close Stanley Airfield. What it did was make clear that Britain could reach it at all, and that the range problem Argentina had been counting on wasn't the shield it looked like. And here's the turn, because the honest version of this story cuts in more than one direction. It wasn't only Argentine planners who misjudged the range problem. British planners themselves had, before the war, more or less written off the idea of a conventional bombing raid on Stanley as impractical, given the distances involved. The Vulcan force existed for a different war entirely, and reactivating it for this one was closer to improvisation under pressure than a rehearsed capability. The near failure of the first mission, saved only by an ad hoc refueling fix worked out mid-flight, wasn't a footnote. It was close to the median outcome for a plan built this quickly, on equipment this old, for a mission this far outside its intended use. Later raids in the same series ran into their own trouble. One Vulcan, on a later Black Buck sortie, suffered its own refueling failure and was forced to divert into Brazilian airspace, landing at Rio de Janeiro and setting off a minor diplomatic incident with a neutral country that had nothing to do with the war. Britain's own after-action assessments in the years that followed were considerably more measured about how much the Black Buck raids actually achieved militarily than the headlines at the time suggested. The raid became a legend faster than anyone could fully audit whether the legend was proportionate to the result. Through all of it, the human thread runs quieter than the statistics. Martin Withers and his crew, a pilot, co-pilot, navigator, radar operator, and air electronics officer, whose names rarely made the front pages the way the mission itself did, spent close to 16 hours in a cramped, freezing cockpit, flew through a fuel emergency that could have ended in a ditching in the South Atlantic rather than a landing back on Ascension, and dropped their bombs on a single pass with no second attempt available. They did not know, in the moment, whether the mission would be remembered as a triumph or a very expensive miss. It landed on the runway. The bomb crater that greeted the dawn light over Stanley on the 1st of May 1982 was not, in itself, a decisive military blow. It didn't close an airfield. It didn't win a war. What it did was answer the question the cold open of this story left hanging. Could a bomber built for a war that never happened be made to matter in a war that did? The answer, delivered by a Cold War relic flying further than any bomber ever had, one gamble at a time, was yes. Not because the tool was perfect for the job, but because the crew and the ground engineers behind it refused to let its age be the reason it failed. This was never really a story about a runway. It was a story about a country stretching an obsolete weapon to the very edge of what it could physically do, and finding out in real time whether that would be enough. Britain didn't send a bomber to the Falklands because it had the right aircraft for the job. It sent one because it was the only aircraft it had left, and made it work anyway. For more incredible true stories from World War II, carefully researched and brought to life, subscribe to the channel and never miss a new documentary. If this kind of improvisation under pressure is your thing, the story of the Vulcan crew that ended up landing, uninvited, in neutral Brazil mid-war is a strange enough follow-up on its own. so it might be worth sticking around for that one. Subscribe if you'd like it when it goes up.